A true gentleman or gentlewoman never steals from their opponents. It's much more socially acceptable to just make token copies of your opponent's broken nonsense stuff, and then make that token unblockable and beat them to death with it to teach them to never ever play dumb cards again. Let's talk about Temmet, Vizier of Naktamun. Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric, and this channel is dedicated to unconventional commander decks and strategies. Now, you've probably heard of Temmet, Vizier of Naktamun, but you might not know what he does. Perhaps that's because Naktamun is a small and relatively uninfluential province with no major exports or plain-wide military presence. Maybe you've never heard of Temmet because his economic policies are fairly safe, uninspired, and ultimately forgettable. But most likely you don't know much about Temmet because even though he supports a token deck strategy, which is a popular archetype, Temmet prefers go tall tokens rather than go wide tokens. But he lacks the hilarious combo potential of Brutaclad. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. What does Temmet actually do? Temmet is a 2/2 human cleric that costs white-blue. He has, at the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature token you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn and can't be blocked this turn. So Temmet can make one of your creature tokens each turn, get a little power boost, and become unblockable. So again, Temmet will generate the most value if you have one big token creature rather than a bunch of small ones. Now he can also become a token himself. Temmet has Embalm for 3 white-blue, which means you can exile this card from your graveyard for its Embalm cost to create a token that's a copy of the creature, except it's a white zombie human cleric. You can only embalm as a sorcery. Now a couple of quick notes about Embalm. First, when you embalm Temmet, you get a token that's a copy of Temmet. That token is not your commander, so it won't do commander damage. But it can make itself unblockable and attack for 3 unblockable non-commander damage. Amazing. Secondly, embalming Temmet allows you to ignore the commander tax, generally half of the time. For example, you can pay white-blue to cast Temmet, and then when it dies, you can send it to the graveyard instead of the command zone. Now you can embalm it from your graveyard for 3 white-blue. When you embalm Temmet, the actual card goes to exile, so you put it in your command zone instead. And then if the Temmet token gets killed, you can just recast Temmet from the command zone, paying the 2 commander tax. And if Temmet dies again, you put it in your graveyard and embalm it again, still just for 5 mana, and so on. So Temmet needs to die many times before the commander tax becomes unreasonable, so that's nice. Now, if we wanted to go big with tokens, we might play things like Desolation Twin, which is a vanilla 10/10, that makes a vanilla 10/10 Eldrazi token when you cast it. Temmet can make that token an unblockable 11/11, which is fine, but really boring. Super boring, let's not do that. Instead, we're going to make token copies of our opponent's creatures, because I love to use my opponent's cards against them. Except, of course, our token copies will be better than the original because Temmet can make them unblockable. Of course, we'll bring along some of our own creatures that love to be tokenized as well, either because they have ETB effects or combat damage effects that will be easy to trigger when Temmet makes them unblockable, because we can't always rely on our opponents having good targets to copy. So with this Temmet deck, we're focused heavily on effects that make token copies of creatures, preferably any creature on the battlefield, including our opponent's creatures if we want to. Now let's talk about those token copy effects in more detail. Now our game plan in this deck is to copy our opponent's best creatures, make them unblockable with Temmet, and smack people with them. And fortunately, there are a lot of pretty decent cards that make token copies of any creature on the battlefield, including our opponent's creatures. Stolen Identity, Dance of Many, and Rite of Replication can all make a token copy of any creature on the battlefield. Now, Stolen Identity is a sorcery that costs 4 blue, so it's pretty expensive, but you make a token copy of any target creature or artifact. And then it has Cipher, so it's sort of like an enchant creature aura at that point. So when you encode Stolen Identity into a creature, you get to cast a copy of Stolen Identity whenever that creature deals combat damage to a player, which should be once per turn if it's encoded onto a token, and Temmet makes that token unblockable. Generally, the most efficient way to make use of Stolen Identity is to already have a token creature on the battlefield that can attack this turn. You hopefully have Temmet to make that token unblockable, and then you cast Stolen Identity to make a token copy of whatever you want, encode Stolen Identity onto that token creature, and then attack with it, get in for combat damage, and make another token copy of whatever you want. So ideally, you'll get at least 2 token copies out of Stolen Identity before your opponent gets rid of it by killing the creature that you've encoded it onto. Now, Dance of Many is a janky old-school enchantment that makes a token copy of another creature when it enters the battlefield, but you need to pay blue at the beginning of your upkeep or sacrifice Dance of Many. And when Dance of Many leaves the battlefield, you exile the token. And Rite of Replication is Rite of Replication. Make a token copy, or 5. Now, Mimic Vat and Fairy Artisans will be making token copies all the time. Mimic Vat is a bit more controllable, but Fairy Artisans is still great, since it basically gives you a copy of all of your opponent's ETB effects on non-token creatures, which is actually kind of annoying for them. It's great for us. Theoretical Duplication is a 3-mana instant that says whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control this turn, create a token that's a copy of that creature. So this is a pretty inexpensive way to make a token copy of whatever you want, well, only an opponent's creature. But do note that it does have that timing restriction. You can't make a token copy of something that's already on the battlefield. Now we'll also use Fractured Identity. This is an expensive removal spell at 5 mana for an instant to exile a target creature. But that creature's controller's opponents each make a token copy of that creature, which is hilarious. And then Vizier of Many Faces is a conventional clone. It enters the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield. So it's not a token, but it does have Embalm for 3 blue, so it can become a token from your graveyard. Now we'll also use some token copy effects that can only target our own creatures. Don't worry, we do have clone-worthy creatures of our own in this deck too, again, just in case our opponents don't have anything we want to copy. But we'll talk about those creatures later. So we'll use Quasi-Duplicate. This is the classic 3 mana make a token copy of one of your creatures. It's a sorcery, but it has Jumpstart, so you can cast it again from your graveyard. Helm of the Host is expensive and telegraphed, but there's no denying that it absolutely needs to be answered or it will run away with games. Soul Foundry is expensive to get started, and it's decidedly worse than Helm of the Host, but it's an okay second copy. This artifact costs 4, and when it enters the battlefield, you may exile a creature card from your hand, and then you can pay X and tap Soul Foundry to make a token copy of that creature, where X is its mana value. So again, unlike Helm of the Host, this will require mana to make that token copy each turn, and that token won't have haste, but it will still give you consistent value throughout the game, if it sticks around. The new Thousand-Faced Shadow is a 1/1 flying ninja that costs blue, but it also has ninjutsu for 2 blue. It has when Thousand-Faced Shadow enters the battlefield from your hand, if it's attacking, create a token copy of another target attacking creature. That token enters the battlefield tapped and attacking. So basically, if you use Thousand-Faced Shadow's ninjutsu ability to get it into play, which you can do fairly easily since you'll have unblockable tokens, of course be aware that if you do that, you'll lose the token when it's bounced back to your hand for the ninjutsu ability, but you can do it. Anyways, if you use ninjutsu to put Thousand-Faced Shadow into play, you can make a token copy of another target attacking creature you control. And then we'll use God Pharaoh's Gift. This 7 mana artifact lets you exile a creature card from your graveyard at the beginning of combat on your turn. If you do, you make a 4/4 token that's a copy of that creature, and it has haste. So I like God Pharaoh's Gift because it lets us reuse our creatures that are in our graveyard, and it makes them tokens, which is great. It also gives them haste, but do be aware that since that token is created at the beginning of the combat step, it'll be too late to make that token unblockable, so just keep that in mind. Then there's Song of the World Soul, which only makes us tokens if we've already got tokens, but it is very powerful. This 6 mana enchantment has, whenever you cast a spell, populate. Again, your opponents will need to remove this or you will generate a ton of value. And then finally we'll use Glasspool Mimic and Mirror Pool for clone effects on lands. Now note that Glasspool Mimic does enter the battlefield as a copy of a creature you control, so it doesn't create a token, but it's also just a land if you need it. Okay, so those are our methods that we'll use to make token copies of creatures. Let's talk about some of our own creatures that are great to copy. Now we'll include a few big creatures of our own that love to be tokenized and get in for combat damage. Like Spawning Kraken, a 6-mana 6/6 Kraken that says whenever a Kraken, Leviathan, Octopus, or Serpent you control deals combat damage to a player, create a 9/9 blue Kraken creature token. Now if you manage to get this beast in for combat damage just once, you'll have a 9/9 token that Temmet can make unblockable. Or if you make a token copy of Spawning Kraken, that token can be made unblockable, and it'll make you 2 9/9 Krakens when it hits, assuming both the original Spawning Kraken and the token copy stick around. There's Dream Troller, or Dream Trawler. This 6-mana pest is a 3/5 Sphinx with flying and lifelink, and you can discard a card to give it hexproof until end of turn. Also, you tap it when you do this. But it also draws you a card when it attacks, and it gets +1/+0 until end of turn whenever you draw a card. This thing protects your life total, it protects itself, and it draws you cards. If you could crystallize the essence of Azorius into a single creature, well, other than Azor, this troll is it. I've also included Dazzling Sphinx, just for fun. As long as we're stealing our opponent's creatures, let's steal their spells too. This 4/5 Flying Sphinx has, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile an instant or sorcery card. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Then that player puts the exiled cards that weren't cast this way on the bottom of their library in a random order. Now because it has flying, Dazzling Sphinx can get in for combat damage, perhaps without being copied into a token and helped by Temmet. It's mainly here to support a theft sub-theme of the deck, and because it's fun. However, this is definitely an RNG card, and if you want to make the deck more consistent, you might swap it out for something else. But you will have a lot of fun with Dazzling Sphinx. Now we also need to talk about Sublime Archangel. This is 2 white for a 4/3 flyer, it has Exalted, and other creatures you control have Exalted. Now because Temmet only makes one creature token unblockable each turn, you might only be attacking with one creature each turn. Sublime Archangel will effectively give that attacking creature +1/+1 for each creature you control. Unless of course you make a token copy of Sublime Archangel, because separate instances of Exalted on a creature do stack. So if you have 2 Sublime Archangels, for example, then your single attacking creature will get +2/+2 until end of turn, and so on. So that's great. Now because of his low mana cost and his Embalm ability, Temmet is somewhat hard to remove, at least for long. But we do have ways to get our creatures in for combat damage, even if we don't have access to our commander. Aven Windguide gives all of our tokens evasion in the form of flying, and it also grants vigilance. Key to the City essentially lets us slow cycle a card for 2 mana to make a creature unblockable. Whispersilk Cloak gives the equipped creature Shroud and unblockable, and of course there's Rogue's Passage. And because we're relying on unblockable creatures and combat damage to win games, we may need to boost our damage output. Blackblade Reforged can easily turn our Temmet token into a high damage threat, though again remember that it won't do commander damage. Lion Sash is a new one from Kamigawa, and this one I like here. It's an equipment creature, so when you cast it, it's a 1/1. You can pay white to Scavenging Ooze someone's graveyard and grow your Lion Sash, but you can also equip it to a creature and boost that creature's power. So Lion Sash can make another token bigger, or you can make a token copy of your Lion Sash when it's unequipped, because then it's a creature. And then Temmet can make it unblockable, and you can exile graveyards to grow it and then attack with it as well, so it's pretty versatile. And of course there's Scytheclaw, which is perfect for Temmet. This equipment costs 5 and equips for 3, so that's a lot. But it has Living Weapon, so it comes into play with a Germ creature token, which it's attached to. That equipped creature gets +1/+1, and when it deals combat damage to a player, that player loses half their life. So Scytheclaw all by itself, because of that Germ token that it comes with, Temmet can make that token unblockable, and Scytheclaw can start cutting down life totals right away. So those are some of our best payoffs and enablers for making unblockable tokens on our own, which again we might want to do if our opponents don't have good things to copy. But we have plenty of other creatures in this deck that'll give us value if we copy them too. Let's talk about how we'll use some of our clone-worthy creatures to fill our ramp, draw, and removal spots. We have lots of effects that draw us card when a creature deals combat damage to a player. Ghostly Pilferer draws you cards when your opponents cast their commanders and whatnot. It can also make itself unblockable and draw you even more cards when it becomes untapped. for a 2-mana fee. Mask of Memory is an equipment that draws you cards. So is Acquisition Octopus, and this is another one of those reconfigure equipment creatures. Whenever it or the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. So it's either a 2/2 octopus if it's unattached, so it can attack and maybe draw you a card and even maybe make you a 9/9 Kraken token, or it's an equipment that grants the same effect, without the Kraken. So super versatile. Speaking of random synergies with spawning Kraken, we'll also use Sea Dasher Octopus. It's a 2/2 octopus with flash and mutate, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. So it's sort of like a single-use Acquisition Octopus. You can either use Sea Dasher Octopus as a standalone creature and make token copies of it to your heart's content, or you can mutate it to buff another creature with its card draw ability. There's Augury Adept, which has no evasion on its own, but if you tokenize it and get him for damage, it'll draw you a card and maybe gain you some life. Curiosity Crafter is an obvious include. It has whenever a creature token you control deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. So it's perfect on its own, and even better to make a token copy or 2 of this guy. Grazilax Illithid Scholar is similar. Grazilax may look somewhat like an octopus, but unfortunately, spawning Kraken is not fooled. Grazilax has whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. Grazilax also lets you bounce your own blocked creatures back to your hand. Not great with tokens, but you can find some use for this with your ETB creatures, like Cloud Blazer, which draws you 2 cards and gains you 2 life when it enters the battlefield. Now because we're in white, we actually have access to lots of creatures that ramp us, and ramp us even more when we make token copies of them. Stoic Farmer, Knight of the White Orchid, and Loyal Warhound, they all have ETB effects that go and tutor planes out of our deck and onto the battlefield, if an opponent has more lands than us. Cartographer's Hawk also goes and gets planes out of your deck, but it does it when it deals combat damage. Now it bounces itself back to your hand when it does this, which is not super great if it's a token. But it is ramp, and tokenizing it does technically give you even more ramp, well again if you're behind on lands. Solemn Simulacrum goes and gets us a land on ETB, and Burnished Heart can be sacrificed to find 2 basics, so it's a decent token copy target. We'll also use Timeless Dragon, which was pretty much made for Temmet. This is a 5/5 flying dragon for 5, which is not bad. You can plane cycle it for 2, so it isn't ramp, but it does at least help you make your land drops. You can also eternalize it for 2 white, so that means you exile it from your graveyard to make a token copy of it, but that token is a 4/4 black zombie. And just like Embalm, you can only eternalize at sorcery speed. So Timeless Dragon is a really versatile card. And lastly, of course, there's Dousing Dagger, which is great ramp whenever you can reliably get him for combat damage against a player. Now for removal, we're relying mostly on non-creature spells, but we do have a few creatures that I want to mention here. Amphin Mutineer and Skyclave Apparition are obvious and annoying exile-based removal on bodies that are also great targets to tokenize. There's also Ixodron, the classic janky blue creature removal mass board wipe. When this 5-mana creature enters the battlefield, you turn all other non-token creatures face down, so they become vanilla 2/2s. And most of the time, those creatures can't be turned face up again, so it's effectively removal. And of course, your token creatures won't be affected. And of course, Perplexing Test is a 5-mana instant that bounces your choice of all token creatures or all non-token creatures to their owner's hands. Obvious include. So that's most of the deck. Check out the link to the full deck list in the description for more details. For now, let's go over the deck stats and cost. Now Temmet, Vizier of Naktamun is a little bit greedy, so this deck has an average mana value of 3.31, which is a little higher than I typically like. But many of the token copy effects are somewhat expensive, and we like to have a few expensive creatures in the deck as well to really get as much value as possible when we make token copies of them. We have 15 cards that clone or make token copies of creatures. Most of these make tokens, since that's what Temmet cares about, but we do have a few clone effects like Glasspool Mimic that don't make tokens. Many of our clone effects also let us target both our own and our opponent's creatures, because copying our opponent's Vorinclex is the best way to let them know that they did wrong. But we also have some clone effects that can only target our own creatures, like Helm of the Host. This deck has 29 creatures, so we'll have plenty of targets of our own to make copies of. if our opponents aren't playing Vorinclex and the like. We also have 12 card draw cards and 11 ramp cards. And this deck is running 10 single target removal spells and 4 board wipes. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $150.07 on tcgplayer.com, so it's a relatively affordable deck, and yes, it is sad that $150 is considered affordable in Commander. So that is Temmet, Vizier of Naktamun. Temmet is a reasonably unpopular commander with only 344 decks on EDHREC at the moment, and I think that's because, again, he rewards you for playing with a single large creature token rather than a bunch of small tokens. But I really like his low mana cost and resiliency. Again, that Embalm ability kind of cuts the commander tax in half. And with this particular Temmet build, we're really focused on using our opponent's creatures against them. And that's one of my favorite ways to build decks, because it scales in power with my opponent's decks. If my opponents are slamming big Eldrazi and stuff, then this deck can do powerful things. But if my opponent's decks have much weaker creatures, then this deck also gets weaker. But again, we've got our own clone targets in the deck, in case our opponents don't provide for us. But that is all I've got for today. If you enjoyed this video, please click that like button, or subscribe if you haven't already, or leave a comment. Or better yet, check out our Discord where you can discuss Commander deck building and maybe play some games. And if you want to support the channel, check out our Patreon. Thanks to all of my patrons. Patrons get to vote on upcoming content and more. You can find the link to the Discord and the Patreon in the description. And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.